While a large part of the fandom is convinced that Gojo has actually passed on, it's definitely not 100% conclusive even now that Satoru Gojo has actually passed on. But before you comment that this video is cope and that he alone is the divided one, just hear me out for a second. There's already a few things about his supposed death that don't exactly make sense, or at least seem uncertain. Not even Gojo himself can tell if this place that he's at is the afterlife or just another dream. But even by the end of the chapter, he still doesn't really know, and neither do we. He's also still got his head attached to his body, so it's not like reverse curse technique is completely out the question. But even if Sukuna did in fact unalive Gojo for sure, we've seen Sukuna use reverse curse technique before to come back from basically as dead as you can get before you've actually died. Even to the point where Gojo with his 6 eyes couldn't tell that Yuji was actually still alive in there. Keeping in mind that Gojo's output with positive energy, the fuel for reverse curse technique, was completely raised after his 3 black flashes, it doesn't seem all that crazy. Black flashes in general put a sorcerer in this zone-like state, but more importantly, it's when their cursed energy manipulation is at an all-time peak. Trying to feel a black flash is feeling the core of cursed energy itself. Just like Gojo had mentioned to Toji Zenin 12 years ago, he should have cut off his head if he wanted to make sure he'd never stand to face him again. Along with the numerous references and parallels made all throughout Gojo and Sukuna's final battle to other series, specifically those where one character in particular, one who's clearly meant to represent Satoru Gojo in the parallel, comes back from the verge of death just like he would in Jujutsu Kaisen. At this point, it really is all far too obvious. This video isn't exactly made to prove that Gojo is in fact not dead, but instead that even if he is, the references, method, foreshadowing, and narrative is all there for the return or maybe even rebirth of Satoru Gojo. Had died back in chapter 236. Sukuna found a way to use Maharaga's method for bypassing infinity, and by using the blueprint with his own dismantle, Sukuna was able to land a slash straight on Gojo's torso. It's not just an ordinary dismantle by any means. Sukuna did this by changing the slash's target from simply Satoru Gojo to the world itself. By cutting through space, Sukuna would by proxy be cutting down Gojo since he's existing in that same space. It's a pretty genius workaround. Why cut through infinity when you can cut through the world itself? Its aftermath left Gojo laying on the battlefield, divided in two. Sukuna says later on that Yui, Mei's brother, must use his teleportation curse technique to take Gojo's corpse all the way to Shoko. But Jaded, Sukuna says that it's a corpse. That means he did unalive Gojo. How does that make you feel? Half Joe? Divided one? Yeah, I'm gonna talk about that more later in the video. In the beginning of chapter 236, we're brought to a scene between Gojo and Geto, and it's not a flashback. It seems to be some dream or some afterlife-like sequence, and we see characters whose roles in the stories have all been cut a long time ago. Those like Nanami, Haibara, Principal Yaga, Riko Amane, and even Toji Zenin, they all appear as those who have passed away too soon, but have all left a great impact on Gojo's life. Every last one of them have a special place in Gojo's heart. They're all those who have touched his life in one way or another. When Gojo begins speaking to all of them, one conversation relates a little bit more to the topic of the video. Nanami tells Gojo about a conversation between him and Mei from way back when he actually considered to leave the Jujutsu world behind. She told him that if he preferred to become someone new, then travel north, but if Nanami insisted, traveling south would be the best to stay the same person you've grown to become. Nanami had decided back then to travel south. He's always been someone who loves looking back at the past. In Gojo's case, it seems like he's about to make a decision. Either go back south and enjoy the person he was before, or he can travel north and become someone entirely new. One thing to point out is the name of the chapter. The chapter title for 236 is actually Heading South. While he may be heading south, it doesn't seem that he's arrived just yet. It's also of course not exactly confirmed that this place and everybody we're seeing is all just part of one big afterlife. There's already a few things here that don't really make sense, especially when considering what we know about what happens to sorcerers when they normally die. First and foremost, Gojo himself even points out that all sorcerers die alone. Even while fighting alongside and coordinating with your allies, you always die alone. When first seeing his best friend again, Gojo immediately brings up this contradiction to Geto, but he ends up brushing it off since in that present moment, the small detail isn't really that important right now. Another aspect is that no sorcerer is supposed to die without regret. This again is something that Gojo begins to question, and he even brought it up to Principal Yaga in that very moment. But by the end of the scene, even after he goes on to speak to all these people, Gojo still isn't really sure if this is simply a dream or the afterlife. For right now, Sukuna's pretty sure that Gojo's been unalived. He mentions that Yui, Mei's brother, must have taken Gojo's corpse, implying that Gojo had actually passed away. Then again, Toji had thought the same thing 12 years ago, only to have him back from the verge of death, ready to fight that same day. Toji, who is definitely sure that he did in fact unalive Gojo, is the same person who's given the nickname Sorcerer Killer, but is also capable of perceiving the soul. The reason why I don't think it's too big of a deal if Sukuna considers Gojo's body a corpse, it's because because we've seen a case twice where somebody is considered biologically dead, but they're still able to be brought back with reverse curse technique. When Yuta had to fulfill his binding vow to unalive Yuji Itadori, he actually did complete the binding vow. When Sukuna had unalived Yuji way back in the beginning of the story, both Shoko and Gojo seem to have considered him biologically dead, only for Sukuna to later revive him back to the real world. With everything I've mentioned so far, it's definitely proved that Gojo's death is at bare minimum inconclusive. There's nothing confirmed as of now that Gojo has actually passed away, along with a fair bit of questions surrounding his death as a whole. This isn't all just to say that Gojo is definitely alive, but that the possibility that he isn't actually dead is still floating in the air. Throughout Gojo and Sukuna's battle, there's many callbacks, homages, and references to work done outside of the series and to other shonen which were used as inspiration all throughout this fight. Both Gojo and Sukuna's outfits, for example, are a clear reference to the outfits that we've seen worn by Gon and Killua from Hunter x Hunter. It's just one of the many references made to the series all throughout Jujutsu Kaisen. Comparing their outfits are really the least of it. Concepts that play a major role in the power system all throughout Jujutsu Kaisen are clearly partially derived and inspired by Hunter x Hunter. Even before I get into the many examples, Gege Akutami, the mangaka for Jujutsu Kaisen, has gone on record saying that he's taken inspiration from Togashi, who's the author of Hunter x Hunter. There's aspects to the Jujutsu Kaisen power system, like disclosing information about your curse technique to raise its power, or binding vows that are used to exchange almost anything for greater power, or even simple domains. The bottom line here is that simple concepts and inspirations in the past has clearly been drawn from Hunter x Hunter and brought to the series before. If we start looking more specifically towards the references that are made to do with Gojo vs Sukuna, there's one reference in particular that really sticks out, and it relates a lot more to the topic of the video. During Gojo's battle with Sukuna, he had temporarily lost his arm from a surprising dismantle landed by Maharaga. Sukuna then complimented Maharaga and the battle continued. Now in Hunter x Hunter, you can find a very similar scene taking place in chapter 355. Chrollo, just like Sukuna, ends up calling for a blow to Hisoka's arm, and Hisoka's arm is then blown off in a similar pose to how Gojo's arm was blown off by Maharaga, before, just like Sukuna once again, Chrollo ends up complimenting the attack. It's then that the side-by-side comparison is very clear. While both of these scenes are nearly mirroring parallels to one another, looking again later on, another potential reference is made. In that same fight, Hisoka is then later killed, but he's brought back to life by Nen that intensifies after death. Yeah, remember this part right here. It's gonna be important, but later in the video. It's also another concept that can also be found in Jujutsu Kaisen. After death, it's a known fact that curses themselves also become stronger, just like Nen. Hunter x Hunter isn't even the first series to have a death which similarly parallels Gojo's, where the one who represents Gojo in the reference is then later resurrected. Twitter was very quick to point out that Baka Survivor actually made one of these references to Satoru Gojo, which of course not only had panels and poses mirroring Gojo and Sukuna's battle, but along with a death with the one in Gojo's place later on being revived. Another thing, go look back at the way that Gojo's sitting with Geto, Nanami, and Haibara. While Nanami chose to go south and stay with the past, we know that way back when, Geto had actually decided to go north. He decided that he was going to break away and completely change his life forever. So while we have Nanami who's now sitting south and Geto who's now sitting north, it's funny to see that Gojo is actually the one sitting north with Geto and not sitting south with Nanami. Now that we have all these things in mind, it's pretty obvious to me that the foreshadowing has been clearly set up for Gojo's return. All that's missing, of course, is how Satoru Gojo comes back to life, how Gojo makes his way back from the verge of death, or even death itself. Using reverse curse technique is the first option that comes to mind, but there's definitely more than a few problems. First and foremost, even if Sukuna did in fact unalive Satoru Gojo, he can still be revived with reverse curse technique. I've already brought this up earlier in the video, but I'm just going to elaborate a little bit more on what I mean. Way back in the detention facility, Sukuna had incarnated for the second time against the finger bearer. Sukuna had ripped out Yuji's heart straight out of his chest to force Yuji to stand down. Sukuna figured that if Yuji tried to switch back while his heart was completely ripped out of his body, then he'd be unalived instantly, and Yuji knows it. Obviously that didn't really work because Sukuna didn't account for the fact that Yuji just doesn't really care for his own life to begin with, especially when it comes to picking his own life and the lives that he could be saving, just like he did with Megami Fushiguro. Now at this point, Yuji had actually died. In the fan book, somebody asked Gege in a Q&A if when Itadori died, was there any effect on Sukuna inside of him? In Gege's answer, he not only confirms that yes, Yuji was in fact unalived by Sukuna, but that Sukuna resurrected him using the reverse curse technique. So despite Sukuna saying that they're not actually dead yet, we have confirmation from the author himself that Yuji did in fact die and was brought back with reverse curse technique. It really makes all the more sense considering the fact that Shoko, with all of her medical experience, and Gojo with his 6 eyes, who was capable of perceiving the soul when looking at Sukuna and Megami's body, didn't know that Yuji and Sukuna were still alive in there. While the conclusion of this video isn't that Shoko's just gonna go up to Gojo and blast him with reverse curse technique, because obviously it's not like Shoko has reverse curse technique on the level of Sukuna by any means, but the point here is that even even coming back from death with reverse curse technique is still possible. Now, another problem that's quick to point out is that since cursed energy comes from the gut and Gojo's torso is, cut in half, can Gojo even really shift the negative cursed energy in his stomach to convert into positive energy to perform the reverse curse technique? Yeah, he definitely can. This shouldn't really stop a lot of people from using reverse curse technique to repair damage to the rest of their body, but especially Satoru Gojo. Even if negative cursed energy comes from your stomach, positive energy is completely different. We saw 12 years back against Toji Zenin, Gojo mentions that he lost the fight the second he chose to not go for the head. We later found out during Kashimo's fight with Akari that this is actually because positive energy from reverse curse technique actually comes from your head and not your gut like the standard negative cursed energy. If you're still not too sure about the gut being a non-factor when it comes to reverse curse technique, Akari is actually a perfect example. Akari flat out gets nearly half of his side blown off by Kashimo's lightning strike and still manages to not only expand his domain while injured, but land another jackpot and use its reverse curse technique bonus to repair the rest of his body completely. When Yuki was cut down by Kenjaku, nearly exactly like Gojo is, she's still able to use her curse technique to the highest degree that we've ever seen. Even while sliced in two, Yuki still manages to create a black hole potentially big enough to destroy the planet itself. Even though Hikari expanding his domain and Yuki creating a black hole aren't uses of positive energy, they at least prove that negative cursed energy can still be used with a damaged or even missing gut in Yuki's case, which means converting that negative energy to positive energy in Gojo's case shouldn't be a problem. While we have seen some crazy reverse curse technique feats all throughout Jujutsu Kaisen, like recovering from poisons or repairing limbs, in order to repair Gojo, it would instantly become the craziest feat with RCT that we've ever seen. Ryu mentioned back in Sendai Colony that repairing just an arm using reverse curse technique is a crazy feat within itself. It's also important to remember that before being sliced down, Gojo did restore his output. Earlier in the fight, it had been temporarily reduced while taking on Maharaga, but after those 3 black flashes, Gojo's output was fully restored according to Kusakabe. Black flashing in general will grant the sorcerer some of the craziest buffs in the entire series. Landing just 1 black flash will instantly upgrade any rookie sorcerer skill with manipulating cursed energy to a level that you can only compare to those who have also landed a black flash. When it comes to understanding your own cursed energy, it's impossible to reach that level of understanding without a black flash. Back when Gojo first achieved reverse curse technique 12 years back, what he was missing was the understanding of what he called the core of cursed energy. When Nobara was trying to remember the feeling of what it's like to black flash, she tried her best to feel the core of cursed energy. It's possible that landing those black flashes brought Gojo to an even greater understanding of the core of cursed energy, even more than he did 12 years back when he first performed reverse curse technique. But then again, even still, we're not just talking about Gojo repairing another arm, but potentially an entire torso. Sukuna mentions that healing others isn't even half as efficient as healing yourself. While Shoko's reverse curse technique has always been fundamentally different, Sukuna says that she doesn't have the type of power between him or Satoru Gojo. From the way Sukuna puts it, he makes it sound like Gojo's reverse curse technique should be somewhat comparable to his own, because even while it's fundamentally different between his and Satoru Gojo, she doesn't have that kind of power. Keep in mind that this Sukuna is at 20 fingers worth of his original power, and he's back in his Heian era form, while the Sukuna that was able to resurrect Yuji was at 3 fingers worth of the power that he's at right now. But while Gojo's reverse curse technique is more than powerful enough, Shoko's reverse curse technique is nowhere near as powerful enough to restore Gojo back to life. But there is one person who can make Shoko's reverse curse technique more powerful than it's ever been. Yudahime can still play a very important role. Her curse technique, Solo Forbidden Area, temporarily amplifies the total cursed energy amount and output of one willing sorcerer within its range, including of course Yudahime herself. By using a combination of incantations with words, gestures, dances, and even music, she was able to elevate her curse technique's potency to about 120%, which is how Gojo was able to fire a 200% hollow purple before the fight even really began. But even if Yudahime did boost her reserve and output, who knows if Shoko's most advanced form of reverse curse technique would be nearly powerful enough to bring Gojo back from the verge of death, or maybe even death itself. We've seen Gojo come back from taking fatal blows and even the verge of death itself, but this is unlike anything we've ever seen from anyone to come back from alive. Even with his restored output with reverse curse technique, I doubt it's going to be enough alone to repair the damage that's done to his body. If it comes down to it, the last option I see is Gojo making a binding vow and giving up something massive in order to make it back alive. When sorcerers reach their limits, there's a point where there's only one way to advance and grow stronger. We've seen characters release all kinds of limits through binding vows. Yuta, for example, he had given up his own life and future to remove the limit of cursed energy placed on Rika. At the end of the day, Gojo's gonna have to give up something massive if he plans on pulling this off. It would have to be something extremely valuable to say the least, and big enough to make this an equivalent exchange. Luckily for Gojo, he is one of the most powerful, rare, and valuable assets ever attained in the world of Jujutsu. Gojo alone, and for the first time in hundreds of years, wields the Six Eyes. When it comes down to it, there is really nothing greater to cover this massive price. Since the day he was born, Gojo has been making headlines as the child that's born with the best combination of abilities that we've ever seen. Having the 6 eyes is what gave Gojo access to his limitless curse technique, but it's also what defined Gojo as the strongest. It molded him into the person that we've been watching for the entire series. By giving up just one of Gojo's 6 eyes, it should be more than enough for him to return back from the verge of death. Gojo losing one of his eyes is something that's been possibly foreshadowed for years, and long before his battle with Sukuna. There's many moments in and outside of the manga that showcase Gojo having one of his 6 eyes seemingly covered or missing from frame. Even in the openings for season 1 of the anime, there's many moments where just one of Gojo's 6 eyes are seemingly missing or out of place. There's even a moment in the opening where one of Gojo's 6 eyes is placed directly behind a broken piece of glass, as if the eye itself was shattered or even destroyed. While normally, I'd brush these off as nothing more than just a coincidence, there's way more than one potential use of Gojo missing an eye, even in scenes all throughout the manga itself. When Gojo had first been caught in Malevolent Shrine, one of his eyes was far more badly damaged than the other, thus being completely covered. In every panel that Gojo's eye was slashed, it's always just one eye and not both. Other moments in the same fight depict the same reference. Gojo seems to be missing just one of his 6 eyes. Moments where Gojo's eye seems to be just out of place or covered or just not visible to the audience. From the very first time Sukuna landed slashes from Malevolent Shrine to when Gojo unveils Hollow Technique Unlimited, Gojo's eye is again missing from frame. Throughout all these scenes, it's like the author is deliberately foreshadowing Gojo's missing eye. There's just way too many coincidental moments with this same reference to completely dismiss the idea of potential foreshadowing out the question. With Gojo paying the ultimate price against Sukuna, it's only fair that it would take giving up something just as insane to reverse history. Trading away just one of his 6 eyes, the tools that he used to become the strongest sorcerer in the modern era, along with being probably the rarest genetic trait in the world of Jujutsu, it may be just enough to bring back Gojo to the world of the living. If you're still not completely sure that giving up a 6 eye would be sufficient enough to complete a revival, there's one more aspect I haven't mentioned that's already been potentially referenced. I quickly mentioned it earlier, but curses become stronger after the death of a sorcerer. While Kusakabe doesn't consider the idea impossible, Higuruma actually says that the logic matches up with their general understanding of curses more accurately. Keep in mind that this is the same guy who is being hailed and rejoiced as a genius while up against Ryomen Sukuna just one chapter before making the statement. Going back to that Gojo afterlife scene for a second, Nanami mentions that curses can also become fuel for life, just like sorcery. That's what explained Haibara's appearance back during Nanami's death in Shibuya. Overall, it definitely isn't impossible. Going back to that clear reference from Hunter x Hunter I mentioned earlier, remember back to Hisoka's revival? It was Nen that intensified after death, just like a curse, that had brought Hisoka back to life, and just like Hisoka, Gojo will do the same. Using a binding vow in a trade to give up one of his 6 eyes, Gojo will return back to life. Gojo's binding vow will strengthen after death like all curses do to push him back from the verge of death, because just like Nanami says, curses can be fuel for life just like sorcery. Without a 6 eye, but another chance at living, Gojo will fulfill both the foreshadowing and the references to his return, and maybe even take another shot at the King of Curses himself. Now that Gojo's method of return is possible, we need a narrative reason for his return in the story in the first place. Many have made the argument that with Gojo's return, it would completely destroy the conclusion to his narrative for his character. Bringing Gojo back to life is something that many in the fandom believe would turn his death into something meaningless. But while I see where they're coming from, I couldn't actually disagree more. I plan to make a way more longer and deep video just about the subject, but to put it simply, death did free Satoru Gojo. Since the day Gojo was born, he's always been destined to play his role as the strongest. When Gege Akutami was asked for his inspiration for Gojo's character, he mentions that he created Gojo at the time to represent the verse's currently uncomplicated power ceiling. The moment he's born, there's a new level of power to compete with. With just his birth alone, Gojo forcefully changed the entire current balance of power. When Gojo was born, they say that he bursted onto the scene. The wording comes off extremely forceful, and it's because it's meant to push the idea that Gojo was just thrown into the world and expected and fated and destined to play his role as the strongest. This is a conflict within Gojo that's been present for basically his entire life. It's the idea behind the question that Geto asked him at the end of the Gojo past arc. Are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest? Is Gojo really the character he plays today because of the gifts that he's forced to bear at birth, or has it been his own choices, personality, and character that have pushed him this far into the top? Was it his personality that ended up defining the person he's grown to become, or could anyone who's born with the things that Gojo has become Satoru Gojo? At first, it can seem like a complicated question, but it actually has a pretty simple answer. He is Satoru Gojo because he is the strongest. Above all achievements in Gojo's life, he's always gonna be one of the strongest before he's ever his own person. 9 very widely different characters who all know Gojo on a very personal level are all asked the same question. Who to them is Satoru Gojo? Between his own friend Nanami, who's known him since his days at Jujutsu High, or Yuji and Nobara, and even Megumi, who's been raised like Gojo's own son, they all give the same answer. Satoru Gojo is the strongest. During Shibuya, we see Gojo push the furthest we've ever seen him into a corner with no options left. He's then forced to make a choice. While he couldn't completely rely on the limitless curse technique, Gojo makes a split-second decision. He decides anyway to expand his domain for just the duration of 0.2 seconds. In a gamble where he chose to bet on himself and his own ability to win, even while not being sure on certain aspects of his plan, and some even decided on the very last minute based on Gojo's own intuition, he still ends up winning. But even after he's done what seemed to be impossible and overcame all the odds himself, he's still credited as nothing else but the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer and not Satoru Gojo. It's a clear example that no matter what he achieves and how high he can climb, Gojo will never be recognized as anything else but the strongest sorcerer. It's hard to know Satoru Gojo, but everyone knows the strongest. When Gojo saw his own reflection in the prison realm, his face is completely blacked out. It's a reference to the credit that he's given as the strongest sorcerer, but not Satoru Gojo. There is no Gojo looking back on the reflection because anyone could be forced to play the role that Gojo has been playing since the day he was born. It's only after he dies that Sukuna actually calls him by his own name, crediting Gojo for being one of those that even the King of Curses will never forget. When Gojo encounters Kenjaku in Geto's body, Gojo mentions that his soul knew deep down that that wasn't actually Geto, but because Gojo's 6 eyes completely dismissed the possibility, Gojo's gut feeling was shut down immediately. He was unable to trust his own intuition and instinct because of the tools that he's given that make him the strongest. Gojo will always be the strongest even to himself before he's ever actually Satoru Gojo. It's both his 6 eyes and his limitless curse technique that make Gojo the person he stands to be today. But if you take away one of those things, what will Gojo become? If it's the 6 eyes that even Tengen says is connected by fate and that's forced those all throughout history to play their own parts, then losing a 6 eye can change Gojo's entire world. Now that he's been thoroughly defeated and cut down from his position of power in the verse, it's time for him to make his own decisions for the first time in his entire life. When Nanami mentions the choice to Gojo between heading north or south, it's his first opportunity to make his own choice. He's no longer acting out the role that he was forced and born to play. He's no longer the strongest, and he's finally just Satoru Gojo. Losing one of his 6 eyes is the perfect representation of the past that he's leaving behind. He's moving forward without his role as the strongest, and without the tool that tied him to that fate in the first place. He'd be making his own deal to come back on his own terms, and just like Gojo forcefully entered the story, he will burst onto the scene and we will finally see the rebirth of Satoru Gojo.